Last week, our discussion laid the historical setting for when Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lived in Andalusian Spain, an Islamic world, a romantic world, a very exotic world in the early 12th century. I told you that this week we would be discussing the other side of the handout, which was the map of KUZARI, and to discuss who were the KUZARs. Because the name of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's work is the KUZARI. And the question, of course, is, what does the word mean? The KUZARI just simply means the man from Khazar, or the man from Khazaria. Now, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi chose a historical figure, and we'll learn about this historical figure in just a moment, is something that we'll need to discuss either tonight, or if we don't have time, we'll touch on that next week. But what we're going to be discussing tonight is who were the KUZARs, and why were they of fascination to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Our story really begins in the 10th century, and I know that I provided you with a lot of historical background about Andalusian Jewry last week. Andalusia, or Al-Andalus, is the Arabic name for the portion of the Islamic Empire that was in the southern part of Europe, primarily in the southern two-thirds of Spain. Going into the Middle Ages, probably sometime into the mid 13th or 14th century, there was still a holdout, a stronghold of Muslims in the area, until finally complete control was ceded to the Christian world. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was not the first generation of Jews that were living in Andalusia. There was a mass migration of Jews from the Middle East that had started pouring into Andalusian Spain already in the 10th century. And as I mentioned last week, Jews were allowed to rise to political power at different times during this, what was known as the Golden Age of Spanish Jewry. And we have a small number of very prominent personalities that emerged during this very fertile period of Jewish culture and Jewish literacy. One of the people that rises to power is a man by the name of Rabbi Chazdai, or Chizdai ibn Shaprut. Rabbi Chazdai lives in the 10th century. He was the vizier to the royal caliph Abd al-Rahman III, who was the ruler of the Cordoban Caliphate that we discussed last week at the time. And he was also the Nasi, he was also the leader of the Jewish community in Cordoba, which was the major center of power and politics in Spain. We have a record of a nation known as the KUZARs from a set of correspondence that Reb Chazdai had sent to the king of the KUZARs, who at the time his name was King Yosef. And we have a record of the letter that Chazdai sent to King Yosef, and we have a record of the letter that came back from King Yosef. As a matter of fact, the cover, make sure the camera sees it, the cover of the Feldheim edition of the KUZARI has this fragment which is on display in Cambridge University Library of one of the fragments and one of the folios of one of the original Chazdai letters. I don't know exactly the history of what's available and what fragments these are, and as far as whether these are transcriptions of the originals, I'm not so sure. But they are letters that are written in Hebrew, and it starts off with Chazdai explaining who he is, where he lives, and why he's writing this letter. And so we learn a tremendous amount of information from the Chazdai letters, and the letter basically goes as follows. Dear King of the KUZARs, and it's extremely respectful. There's a beautiful poem written acrostically with the signature of Rabbi Menachem ibn Suruk, if you remember that name from last week's lecture, who was the great philologist and poet and linguist that was living in the 10th century that Rashi often quotes in his Torah commentary. And Menachem was the scribe that Chazdai used for writing all of these very fancy political letters. And he writes a letter to the King Yosef of the KUZARs, and he says to him that we are living in the diaspora. We are a small and humble people, and it has been many years that we are in exile, and our hearts are humbled and crushed because of the present state of Jewish squalor in the world of the diaspora. And yet our hearts were filled with hope and optimism when we heard of a mighty nation across the sea, very far away to the east, of the KUZARs, an entire nation of Jews who instill fear into the hearts of all of their neighbors. And this filled our hearts with great pride. It filled our hearts with great optimism that here we are with the ability to reconnect to a segment of our people who have been lost to us for centuries. What tribe are you from? Tell me about yourselves. How can we connect and become one again and to restore the prestige of the Jewish people together with the Jews of KUZARI? And part of the letter, just to show you that Chazda ibn Shaprut feels that the KUZARs are the original Jews that have been lost as a result of the destruction of the temple, he writes to him towards the end of the letter as follows: I also seek to know from my master, the way he's addressing King Yosef in the third person, the solution to a mystery. Please inform if you possess any record of when the end of our exile will take place. Perhaps you know, because we don't know when Mashiach is coming, but perhaps you possess a Masorah that we do not have. We have been waiting many years for this time, moving from one captivity to another, and from one exile to another. How strong is the hope and anticipation for this time. One cannot contain himself over this. How can I remain silent over the destruction of our glorious temple and over the remnant of those who have escaped the sword and have passed through fire and water? We live in the diaspora, and there is no power in our hands. They say to us every day, every nation has a kingdom, but you have no memory of such in all the land. But when we heard about the master, the king, the might of his monarchy and his mighty army, we were amazed. We lifted our heads, our spirits returned, our hands were strengthened, and my master's kingdom was our defense. I fervently hope that this news will gain added strength, for through it we will be elevated further. Blessed is God, Lord of Israel, who has not withheld our Redeemer, nor has he withheld rulership and kingdom from the tribes of Israel. May our master, the king, live forever. And this is sort of the way that he gets to the end of the letter. Just one more paragraph. You can read the Chazdai letter in its totality, from Chazda ibn Shaprut to King Yosef. Well, here's the response, which is also printed in here and translated into English. The response that Chazda ibn Shaprut gets back from the KUZAR king, Yosef, is very different from what he was expecting. And the response that he gets back was, I was delighted to receive your letter. It's so wonderful that you wrote. We should get together, schmooze, and have a coffee one day. Basically is really what the letter is saying. And he says, but allow me to tell you the history of our people. We are not one of the lost tribes of Israel. We originally were a group of nomadic tribes that had pagan worship in our kingdom. It is true that we are a powerful kingdom, but we had no formal religion other than the shrines that we instituted for the gods. We had multiple deities. And here's our story about how our kingdom became Jewish. Once upon a time, we had a wonderful king. His name was King Bulan. And he lived a couple of 100 years ago. And Bulan was a righteous and benevolent king. And one evening, King Bulan had a dream. And in this dream, he was visited by an angel. And the angel told him, seek out the truth, my son, and be able to serve your Creator in the proper way. I'm paraphrasing the exact words, of course. You can see the actual text in the response in the response of King Yosef in the Chazdai letters. And the king therefore realized that he had to do something, had to take action. He knew that there was something amiss if he was visited in this dream by the angel. And so he therefore took it upon himself to summon the great clerics of the religious world to be able to present to him the proper religious path for the KUZAR people and for himself. And so he summons a Qadi, which is an Islamic judge. He summons a priest, and he summons a rabbi. And he has them come to his kingdom and asks them to present to the king and his court their arguments as to which faith is the superior faith. And the story continues that as over the course of time, the king found himself drawn more and more to the convincing arguments of the rabbi. And he came to the realization, and it seems even that the angel himself had sort of drawn the king towards the direction of the rabbi. And so when it was time for the king to finally say farewell to the three foreign clerics, the night before they were about to leave, he secretly summoned the priest to his palace. And he said to him, "Between you and me, we understand that Christianity is the superior faith. But if you had to choose which is the second most important faith, would you choose between Islam or Judaism?" And so the priest says, well, of course, the foundation for everything that we believe in the New Testament is the Jewish Old Testament. And the Muslims are a bunch of barbarian, sword-wielding horsemen who go on killing rampages. We could never associate ourselves with them. And the king says, "Thank you very much," and sends him back to his tent. And then he just as covertly summons the Qadi into his tent, and he says, "Between you and me, we both know that Islam is the superior faith. But if you had to choose the second most important faith of the world, what would it be? Judaism or Christianity?" And he says, "Well, the Christians eat all manner of creeping and vile creatures such as pig flesh. That's certainly anathema to us. And they are barbarians, and they don't understand the truth. And of course, the foundation of everything that we believe in the Quran or the stories of the Jewish Bible, although they may be distorted and rectified and verified and clarified by our Prophet Muhammad, but of course the Jewish faith is the oldest and forms the foundation for all the faiths." And the king says, "Thank you very much," and he sends him back to his tent. And the following morning, he calls all three clerics together and he says, "By the testimony of your own mouths, I have decided to choose the Jewish faith, for it is, by all of your admissions, a faith that deserves to be honored and glorified." And so that is how, according to King Yosef, his ancestor, King Bulan, converted to Judaism, and he was eventually able to prevail upon many other people in his kingdom, and they too converted to Judaism as well. Now, interestingly enough, this is not the only account of a conversion of the Khazars to Judaism. In an old historical Islamic chronicle, there is also a story of the conversion of the Khazar king, King Bulan, to Judaism. You know that Muslims took great pride in a number of things in the medieval period. One of the things that they took pride in was the great amount of traveling that many of the great Islamic explorers would do throughout the globe. Even before Marco Polo did many of his travels to the Far East, Muslims were doing much of this work. And so there are many Muslim works that are written in the early medieval period describing the travels of these great Islamic explorers. And one of the Muslim explorers describes how he too has visited the Khazar region and has heard about the mass conversion of the king to Judaism. And it is true that the king had called and summoned the great clerics of the world to his kingdom. But sadly, the reason why the king did not discover the truth of Islam was because en route, the Qadi that was supposed to come to the Khazar kingdom was poisoned by the Jew and never made it to the Khazar kingdom. And of course, therefore, since there was no representation, the king had no choice but to convert to Judaism. That's, of course, different views of the same historical event. Now, that's a record that we have of how the Khazars converted to Judaism. Now, what does this have to do with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi? We fast forward some 200 years later, it's 200 plus years later. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is living in the 12th century. Golden age of Spanish Jewry is beginning to decline, as we mentioned last week. And yet, he is very familiar. There are many stories within Jewish folklore about great Jewish travelers and Jewish legends and tales about many different stories across the globe about Jews. As a matter of fact, it's a fascination among people even in the 21st century about the history of Jewish travelers and explorations and things like that. There's even a book that you can buy in English called Jewish Travelers, which has a number of different chapters about very famous historical figures like Eldad Hadani and like King Bulan of the Khazars, that talk about different very exotic Jews who come from very exotic places, crossing the Sambatyon River in order to be able to reach Jewish civilization. They come from one of the lost tribes of Israel, and so forth. So this is a fascination among Jews for many, many years, especially since we're a diaspora people. We always love learning about Jews that come from exotic places. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is familiar with this folk tale. Everyone knows about the Chazdai letters. Everyone knows about the story of the Khazars, even though at the moment that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is living in Islamic Spain, the Khazar kingdom itself is beginning to crumble and decline. There's very little contact between these two areas, very little travel between the two places. And as I mentioned last week, you can actually take a look at the map of KUZARI before you, and you'll note that it is a land area that was known to historians. You can actually go to any historical atlas, whether you go to a bookstore or to a library, go to any historical atlas of the period around from the times of the 6th century to the 12th century, and you'll find an area in what is now southwest Russia called Khazaria, or the Khazars. And it was a very known, distinct empire that lasted for about some 500 years in one incarnation or another. It's located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. There's even a legend, and it abuts it goes all the way up north to where Kiev is in the Ukraine, goes all the way down south to the countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. It is included in that territory are the Caucasus mountain range, where a number of historians believe that the Caucasian civilization erupted from that place at some point in history. And this is what is known as the Khazar region. It's clear from archaeological excavations that there was such a nation known as the Khazars that lived there for a certain period of time. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is very familiar with the story. He decides to use this story, as is often done in a number of people's writings, to use a story that is based upon fact to present what he feels is an important exposition on Jewish theology, Jewish belief, Jewish philosophy perhaps, and he uses as his cast of characters in presenting this story, he uses the king, Bulan, as the main protagonist, as the man who is having a dream and is visited in the dream by an angel. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi changes the story a little bit, and if we have time tonight, we'll get to the way that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi changes the story. If we don't have time tonight, we'll get to it next week. But it's a very, very important part of our introduction to Sefer KUZARI. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi uses the voice of King Bulan to ask the questions that he feels need to be asked, the questions that are being asked by the Jews of his time, to challenge what the foundations of Judaism are, why Judaism is such a legitimate faith, why, when we are attacked from without by other faiths and belief systems, why Judaism remains the superior system of belief that every Jew should and must subscribe to, and also when we are faced with attacks from within, from sectarian Jews who deny, let's say, Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, why it's important, and he uses the questions from King Bulan that he imagines King Bulan must have asked in that court when he met with the rabbi for the first time, and he puts those questions in the mouth of King Bulan. And then he has the rabbi in the story respond very, very appropriately to all of these questions. And the rabbi really represents Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's answers to all the questions of the people of his time. This is why we believe what we believe. This is what the Torah is all about. This is why Torah Sheba'al Peh is a legitimate authority within Judaism. This is why we're not Muslims. This is why we're not Christians. And this is why we don't subscribe to Greek philosophy, and so forth and so on. All right, so that's what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi chooses to employ. Now, what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was essentially doing was employing a methodology of literature that was very much in vogue in the medieval period. It's really known as one of the methods known as the Socratic method, within the Socratic method. The Socratic method is simply a way of presenting information that makes it more palatable and makes it more readable. When we want to be able to catch a reader's interest and attention to some important information which may at times come across as dry and technical, you want to be able to animate it in some way. So, and especially if it's on the printed word and you don't have the opportunity to dialogue and interface with the speaker, so you have to create some kind of excitement that jumps off the page. So Plato, when he wrote his Republic, wrote a book about a dialogue that involves Socrates and his student. And the students asked Socrates, why do you believe what you believe? And Socrates responds. This was Plato's way of presenting the beliefs of basic Greek philosophy to a readership which wanted to be able to, which he felt needed to be engaged. And so he writes it in the form of a dialogue with his Rabbi, Socrates. So this is a methodology that is very well known in the medieval period, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi employs that method as well. That's really why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi chooses this story at the face value. There's a far deeper reason why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi chooses to employ the story, in my opinion, and that will be addressed at some point later. One of the things that I touched upon last week was that one of the things that was very demoralizing for Jews living in 12th century Spain during this golden age is that you find that there are great world empires in the Islamic world and in the Christian world, and the Jewish people who profess to have the one true Torah seem to have not been very influential in the world and have sort of remained cloistered unto themselves. And should not truth lie with the masses? Should there not be some representation of a great empire in the world that represents the truth of Judaism? So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, well, in defense of that argument, we can look to the Khazars and show you that for a very significant period of time, there were Jews. There was a Jewish empire. There was a Jewish world among the Khazars, and despite the fact that Jews, by and large, have been oppressed in our diaspora existence, nevertheless, there have been pockets of light in our history, including an entire empire, which was the pride of the region that it occupied, instilling fear in all of its neighbors. So there are a couple of questions that we have to ask. Number one, was there ever such a country as the Khazars? That we've already verified that yes, the answer is for sure yes. But there are two other questions that we have to ask. Number one, were the Khazars ever Jewish? In other words, is the report that the Khazars were a nation of Jews, was it ever verified historically? And number three, if the answer to that question is yes, is the story that is recorded in the Chazdai letters and that is perpetuated by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the KUZARI, is that an accurate account of how the Khazars converted to Judaism? So to answer question number two, we will answer in the affirmative that there seems to be incontrovertible evidence that there was a Jewish presence in this area called Khazaria. It was not until the 20th century when it could be verified through archaeological evidence. It was just a legend that had been passed down. There were travelers that were able to verify a Jewish presence. But no modern historian could really ever verify that until archaeologists went to do their digs in this part of Russia, what was ancient Khazaria, and were able to actually dig up ruins of synagogues, of mikvaot, of yeshivot, and so forth, to actually verify, and Torah scrolls, to actually verify that there was a Jewish presence in this area called Khazaria. As a matter of fact, there's one theory that argues that the origin of the Magen David, of the Star of David, actually originates in Khazaria. It was originally a pagan symbol. It was adopted by the Khazars, and then it eventually became a Jewish icon of religiosity and of Jewish commitment. There are other theories about how the Magen David got started, but there's no one clear source of where the Magen David comes from. But in any event, there seems to be conclusive evidence that the Khazars had a Jewish presence. It's not clear exactly how pervasive the religion was, but you need to put it in perspective. When we say that Indonesia is an Islamic nation, that does not mean that every Indonesian citizen goes to the mosque every Friday. What it means is that it's a national religion, so that to whatever extent, when the person got married, he would have to have a chuppah. And when a person got divorced, they would have to give a get. And when there was a funeral, they would have to be presided over, or any other life cycle event, it would be presided over by the religious cleric in the nation whose national religion is that religion. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Khazars were very farfrumt and that they were very observant. There was certainly probably a very significant part of the population that was committed to Judaism, but by and large, if this was the national religion of an entire empire, it stands to reason that there were Jewish structures and Jewish infrastructure, but not everyone was an Orthodox Jew as the way we understand it today. Now, the question, of course, though, is, how did they all become Jewish? And we have this account from King Yosef to Chazdai ibn Shaprut. And the account is beautiful. It talks about an angel visiting King Bulan, the righteous king, in a dream, and telling him to seek out the truth. And Judaism is discovered as being the one true path, and it instills the Jewish psyche with tremendous pride that a person should independently come to convert to Judaism. An entire kingdom should become Jewish because of this idealistic pursuit of truth. However, there are a number of historians who de-romanticize the story for us, so it sort of burst our romantic bubble somewhat, and they explain to us that there's a very pragmatic reason why the Khazars converted to Judaism. If you take a look at your map, you'll notice something quite interesting. To the north of this Khazar region is primarily either no man's land, is a netherland, moving further and further east. But as you go north and further west into the European continent, you discover that the empire is predominantly Christian. Holy Roman Empire. When you look to the south of where the Khazar territory was, you see a very large and vast Islamic empire. And now you have this very strong, very proud Khazar people who are advancing into a more modern age of enlightenment where people subscribe to monotheism. And here they are, constantly threatened by attacks and armies from the south, attacks and armies from the north, and they need to assert power and independence and autonomy and national identity. Well, how do you do that? The two other monotheistic faiths have already been taken. There's Christianity to the north, there's Islam to the south. There's only one religion left that can really show that we are part of the world of modern man, have a monotheistic faith, and yet still are distinct and isolated from the other two empires. Judaism is the only other option that's available out there. And so many historians argue that for a very pragmatic reason, the Khazars chose Judaism as their national religion to create an independent identity for themselves, different from the north and different from the south. So we don't know exactly whether the Chazdai letters account of the conversion is accurate or not, but we do know that there was a Khazar kingdom. We know that this Khazar kingdom was most likely had Jews that came from the west and infiltrated the area, just like if you would have like a community kollel travel to some exotic place, or a Chabad shaliach travel to an exotic place in order to start to spread the word of Judaism to the people. There were people who traveled to Khazaria to help foster this Jewish nationalism, but by and large this was a nation of converts. Now this is quite significant today for us as well for an entirely different reason. A number of years ago, when the first edition of my translation of the KUZARI came out, I decided to, in perhaps a admittedly vain sense of curiosity, I Googled myself in my book. I wanted to see who was reading the book. So as I Googled the book, one of the first entries that comes up in Google, I click on the website, and it's a Palestinian website. And I'm quoted somewhere in this website, in one of the essays, they quote from my book. Click on the second entry, and I discover that it's a neo-Nazi white supremacist website. Real Yiddish Anachas, right? So what is my book doing on these websites? So here's the fascinating thing. In the mid-70s, there was a book that came out by a man named Arthur Kessler, who was a very famous playwright and author, who wrote a book called The 13th Tribe. The 13th Tribe was an expose about the Khazars and who they were and where they come from. And he goes through, using a lot of the earlier scholarship and basically repackaging the earlier scholarship about the Khazars and their Judaism. And then towards the end of the book comes up with a very interesting and fascinating and very intriguing theory. The theory goes something like this. What happened to the Khazars? We know that eventually they were overrun by a group by a nomadic tribe known as the Rus. The Rus came all the way from Scandinavia. They were seamen. They're known today as Vikings. And the face of the European continent and even Eastern Europe changed because of the mighty Vikings that came from Scandinavia and invaded the entire area and eventually became the foundation for what is known as the modern empire of Russia, the nation of Russia. They were the ones, even though the Khazars suffered tremendous casualties from attacks from the south, from Muslim empires, and from other kinds of tribesmen, but the Rus were the ones who mainly overran them. And they dispersed the Khazars, and the Khazars, as many empires do that fall, got absorbed into the conquering empire. What happened to all the Jewish Khazars? Where did they go? So Kessler theorizes that, well, by and large, these Khazars eventually settled in Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, which was really where the Khazar area is located. And therefore it stands to reason that when we put two and two together, and we look at certain distinctive features of Ashkenazic Jewry compared to their Mediterranean Sephardic counterparts, and we don't find very much of a resemblance, right? It would seem that any Jew who has blonde hair and blue eyes, or red hair, right, should start to question, hey, where do I come from? And perhaps there is a large amount of Khazar blood coursing through us white-skinned Ashkenazi Jews and fair-haired, blue-eyed Ashkenazi Jews. Probably more Khazar blood than there is authentic Jewish blood. And therefore Kessler theorizes, and it was so controversial when the book first came out, that today's Ashkenazi Jews, who are the majority of the people in Israel, at least certainly when he wrote the book, are really not such Jews. You know, we come from converts. We're not really the original 12 tribes of Israel. Creates a tremendous furor. But certainly when the Palestinians get a hold of this information, it creates a tremendous furor for them as well. Because who are these interlopers, these usurpers of our land, who claim this 3,000-year connection to the land of Israel, to the ancient land of Israel? They call themselves the original descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they're imposters. They're really a bunch of people who descend from converts and are just Jewish wannabes. And they're a foreign invader who are trying to take our land from the authentic heirs of the Middle Eastern territory, we, the Palestinian nation. And therefore, and look, even Rabbi Korobkin talks about the Chazdai letters and how the Khazars converted to Judaism, and you put that together with Arthur Kessler's theory, and you have the Jewish world as being imposter Jews, without any entitlement to any square inch of the land of Israel. That's what it's doing on Palestinian websites. What's it doing on white supremacist neo-Nazi websites? Well, think about it this way. If you look at the Chazdai letters carefully, you will see that when King Yosef details the heritage of the Khazar people, he traces the original Khazars from the family of man that begins with Yefet. And Yefet had a number of sons, Gomer, Magog, Togarma, etc., Yavan. And one of the descendants of one of these families of Yefet eventually starts the Khazar Empire. And we put that together, and we know that there's supposed to be a great apocalyptic war that is recorded not only in the Old Testament, in the books of Ezekiel and Zechariah, but also in the New Testament, talking about the great apocalypse that will happen when the nations of the world, especially the evil Gog and Magog, or as the Christians might know it as some incarnation of the Antichrist, will rise up against the true nation of Israel, and will wage this final war until that will culminate and climax in the second coming. And of course, what do we do with the Jews of today? The Jews of today, they're Gomer and Magog, they're Gog and Magog. They're the ones who are going to wage the war against the real children of Israel, the heirs of our Savior, our Lord, who are the true children of Israel. And the Jews of today are the imposters. They come from Japheth, who is the progenitor of Gog and Magog and of the Khazars. And they're the ones who falsely represent themselves as the children of Israel, but in reality they are the Antichrist, and they are the ones who must be vanquished. Shkoyach, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Shkoyach, Rabbi Chazda Ibn Shaprut. Look at what these people have done with this very important historical information and used it against us. But it's not only outsiders who have used this information against us. Comes along a very distinguished professor at Tel Aviv University about 3 years ago, a fellow by the name of Professor Sand, and he suggests that he does a study, and he writes a book, and in the introduction of his book, he writes, and the name of the book is The Invention of the Jewish People. And he writes this even though he is a scholar of modern France and knows nothing, or really has no expertise, about ancient Khazars. He writes a book about the Khazars and suggests and argues that the Jews of today of Ashkenazi descent are, as Kessler had argued, descendants from the ancient Khazars. And therefore, as he writes in his introduction, which is extremely controversial because it comes out at a time during when the rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel are being challenged, he writes that this story is what I'm about to tell you is based on fact, but it also has much myth and romanticism in it because of his own agenda, which he openly confesses to, in that he says that the Jewish state should not be a Jewish state; it should be a secular state, and we should be open to integration and the right of return, because we don't have an ancestral biblical right to this land. We just happen to be here. Well, those are fighting words. And so when the book came out, when Kessler's book came out, now this is going back over close to 40 years, Khazar scholars and scholars of this Turkic, Russo area all come out against Kessler. They say Kessler is not an expert in Khazar history, is not an expert in this region of the world at this particular time in the world. And we can verify very clearly that the populations of Ashkenazi Jewry did not inflate the way they should have, according to Kessler's theory, during the times when we would have expected them to. And there were significant populations of Jews in Poland and Eastern Europe well before the Khazar Empire disbanded. But Sand apparently was not satisfied with the scholars in the 70s who debunked Kessler's theory, and he therefore insists on advancing this theory and continues to. But fortunately, we have something called DNA evidence, and as recently as just last year, there was an article in Newsweek entitled "The DNA of Abraham's Children. Analysis of Jewish Genomes Refutes the Khazar Claim." This is an article from June 3rd, 2010 in Newsweek, where the article starts off by saying Jews have historically considered themselves people of the book, referring to sacred tomes. But the phrase is turning out to have an equally powerful, if unintended, meaning. Scientists are able to read Jewish genomes like a history book. The latest DNA volume weighs in on the controversial, centuries-old, and now revived in a 2008 book, claim that European Jews are all the descendants of Khazars, a Turkic group of the North Caucasus who converted to Judaism in the late and early 9th century. The DNA has spoken. No. And that's how she starts off her article. What the DNA actually shows conclusively is that Ashkenazi Jews genetically have more in common with Sephardic Jews than Ashkenazic Jews have in common with Gentiles who in the same countries from which they hail. In other words, I, as an Ashkenazi Jew whose ancestry is Polish and Russian, have more in common if you come from a Mediterranean or an African part of Sephardic Judaism than I would have with a Christian or Gentile Pole or Russian. And that is very, very compelling evidence indeed. And basically the way the scientists read the data is that as much as Sand, a professor, a postmodern Israeli political scientist who has an agenda of his own to present, it packaged in an academic wrapper, right, would like us to believe that we as the Jews in Israel today have no ancestral connection at all to the biblical land of Israel and to the Bible. the DNA evidence tells us mountains of evidence that goes otherwise. Now, of course, we should also bear in mind from a halachic standpoint, whether you and I are descended from converts or whether we're descended from the 12 tribes of Israel is irrelevant. We all have the equal claim to Eretz Yisrael. But the point of the matter is that they're not, the world, and certainly not the professors in Tel Aviv University, are not really interested in whether or not halachically we have a claim to Eretz Yisrael. They want to know that there's a historical connection. But Baruch Hashem, the DNA evidence has spoken mountains. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'll hold that for questions. Next week, what we're going to do is I'm going to actually try to present to you my feeling as to why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi specifically chose this episode of the KUZARs as his platform for his presentation of his unique view of Jewish theology and Jewish ideology and what we believe as Jews. It's not just that he chose a fanciful story that was very interesting and very engaging to the reader. And it's not just because the KUZARs represented Jewish pride because they had started their own empire of the Jewish faith. It goes far much deeper than that. It goes actually to the very story of the angel visiting King Bulan in a dream and the message that Bulan told him. Your intentions are desirable to your Creator, but not your deeds. Let's hold on to that sentence because that forms the central sentence of all of Sefer KUZARI. And beyond that, what we're also going to discover next week is how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi changes the story in order to be able to have it fit into the presentation that he needs to present to the Jews of his time. So we'll hold on to those two ideas, and right now we'll take some questions before we have to recess. Yes, please.
So first of all, then, in other words, we can't trace the descendants of the KUZARI. They're not traceable. They kind of melded into communities.
We don't really know what happened to them. In all likelihood, as I mentioned before, because Judaism was a national identity more than it was a national religion, in all likelihood, the people who were part of the Khazar Empire and who identified as Jewish, once the new management took over, and it was the Kievan Rus, so they said, okay, so now there's a new boss. So we'll all pledge allegiance to the new boss. Christianity, Judaism, next year it'll be something else. We all trying to survive, So the Khazars were more likely than not mostly secular and didn't really care as much. Judaism was the national identity, not the national faith. Yeah.
I'm also curious, before Google, how did this rabbi find this empire and this king? And how did he know how to communicate with him and locate him and write letters and all that? It sounds modern.
Well, there were travelers, there were people who were traveling back and forth, not sporadically, and there were records of these travelers who had come from exotic places and brought back this account of this amazing Jewish empire. But you see how spotty and how vague and unclear this communication was. Here you have Chazda ibn Shaprut who thinks that we've reconnected one of the lost tribes of Israel when in reality it was nothing like that at all. I should point out that many historians say that the name of the famous rabbi in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's story is a man by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak HaSingari. We don't know too much about him, but he was one of these very mysterious Jewish travelers. And some historians, early historians, place the identity of this rabbi of the KUZARI as Rabbi Yitzchak HaSingari from a place called Singar, which I'm not really sure whether that's Singapore or some other place that is farther to the east. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned that the king chose between the three major faiths. With such a prevalence of the Christian and Muslim faith, was at that time the Jewish faith really as strong enough to be considered?
Well, that speaks to the historical accuracy of the story. I don't know how to respond other than to say either it did, either the king had heard about Jews and understood that Jews formed the foundation of the two other major faiths, or, as some historians have argued, that really there's no truth at all to the story and that the Khazar king chose Judaism for political reasons. Yes, take the last question.
With regard to the DNA that you were mentioning, there's also, I heard, another thing called the Cohen haplotype DNA marker, which shows the connection or a high
Right.
probability of the connection of those people who claim to be Kohanim today
Yes.
actually have the same
The Kohen gene, right, connects a lot of Kohanim, and also a certain tribe of tribesmen in Africa somewhere. So go figure. They may be part of the lost tribes of Israel as well.
Wasn't David HaMelech a redhead?
According to the Medrash, he was, but you never know. So anyway, it's just something to think about. Anyway, please go to the next session. You have some outstanding speakers this evening. Please go and find your groups and have a good night.